The Wendigo wasn't born screaming in the woods. It was born starving. Picture this: snow covering everything as far as the eye can see, silence so absolute you can hear your own heartbeat, and a man standing in the middle of it all, knowing that winter has just begun and his food has already run out. That's where this story starts. Not with claws or fangs or glowing eyes in the darkness, but with an empty stomach and the slow, creeping realization that help isn't coming. See, people think monsters hunt you. They imagine something lurking in the shadows, waiting to pounce, something with malice and intent. But hunger doesn't hunt. Hunger just waits. It sits in the corner of the room, patient as stone, knowing that eventually you'll come to it. And when you do, when you finally give in to what it's been whispering in your ear for days or weeks or months, that's when the transformation happens. Not into something with fur and claws, but into something far more dangerous, someone willing to do whatever it takes to survive. Every Wendigo story is really about hunger and what it turns people into. This isn't a tale about a creature in the woods. This is about what happens when civilization strips away, when the rules we live by start to feel like suggestions, when the line between human and monster becomes so thin you can step over it without even noticing. This is about the moment when survival stops being noble and starts being something else entirely. People think monsters hunt you. Hunger just waits. Let's talk about winter in the Northern Territories, the kind of winter most people today can't even imagine. We're talking about the northern United States and Canada, stretching back to the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, places where winter wasn't just a season but a test of whether you deserved to see spring. These weren't the winters you see in holiday movies, with pretty snowflakes and warm fires and families gathered around singing songs. These were the winters where temperatures dropped so low that stepping outside without proper clothing could kill you in minutes, where snowdrifts buried entire cabins, where the sun barely rose above the horizon for months at a time, casting everything in a perpetual twilight that played tricks on your mind. Communities in these regions were isolated in ways we can barely comprehend today. There were no phones, no internet, no way to call for help if things went wrong. If you lived in a settlement of 20 or 30 people, those were the only faces you'd see until the thaw came. If you lived alone or with your family in a cabin miles from the nearest neighbor, you were on your own. Completely, utterly on your own. Food was everything. Not in the abstract way we think about it today, where running out of milk means driving to the store, but in the concrete, life or death way where running out of food meant you had a decision to make. Hunt, hope, or die. Those were your options. And hunting in the dead of winter, when animals were scarce and hidden, when tracking meant trudging through waist-deep snow in sub-zero temperatures, was a gamble. Sometimes you came back with game. Sometimes you came back with nothing. And sometimes you didn't come back at all. Starvation wasn't a possibility. It was a season. It showed up as reliably as the snow, and communities knew it was coming. They prepared as best they could, stockpiling food, preserving meat, rationing supplies. But preparation only goes so far when winter lasts 5 months and your stores run out in 3. Then what? Then you start making calculations. How long can we stretch this? Who eats first? How much can a person survive on before they stop being useful? Compare that to today. Right now, if you're hungry, you can scroll through an app and have food delivered to your door in 30 minutes. You can walk to a store that's open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, filled with more food than you could eat in a year. You have backups for your backups. Refrigerators. Freezers. Pantries. The idea that you might actually run out of food, that you might face genuine starvation, feels absurd. It's so far removed from our reality that we've turned it into entertainment, survival shows where people pretend to struggle for a few weeks before going home to their comfortable lives. But back then, there was no going home. There was no escape. There was just winter, and silence, and the slow gnawing of hunger that never quite went away even when you did manage to eat because you knew what was coming. You could survive a lot of things. Winter just checked your math. It tested whether you'd done everything right, whether you'd planned well enough, whether you'd been lucky. And if you failed any of those tests, winter didn't care. It just kept going, indifferent and relentless. This is the world where the Wendigo was born. Not in mythology books or campfire stories, but in the real, lived experience of people who understood that hunger wasn't just discomfort. It was a force. It was a presence. It was something that could change you from the inside out if you let it. And sometimes, even if you didn't. Before the Wendigo became the stuff of horror movies and internet creepypasta, before it turned into another monster to sell Halloween decorations, it meant something very specific to the people who told the stories. The Algonquin peoples of the northern forests, groups like the Ojibwe, Cree, and Innu, didn't see the Wendigo as entertainment. They saw it as a warning, a cultural concept wrapped in the language of the supernatural, because sometimes the only way to talk about the worst things humans can do is to make them into something other than human. The Wendigo wasn't just a creature. It was a process. It was what happened when someone crossed a line that should never be crossed, when they consumed human flesh out of desperation or greed or madness. But it wasn't the act itself that created the Wendigo. It was what came after. Because according to the stories, once you tasted human flesh, something inside you changed. The hunger didn't go away. It grew. You ate and ate and ate, but you were never full. The more you consumed, the more you needed to consume, until there was nothing left of the person you'd been. Just hunger wearing a human shape. This wasn't a monster that hunted people in the woods, at least not at first. This was a monster that used to be one of them. A neighbor. A family member. Someone who'd sat at the same fires, shared the same meals, told the same stories. Someone who'd made a choice, or had a choice forced upon them, and had been transformed by it into something that looked human but wasn't anymore. The Wendigo was described as gaunt, skeletal, impossibly tall, with skin pulled tight over bones and eyes that reflected nothing but emptiness and need. Some versions said it smelled like decay, that you could sense it coming before you saw it. Others said it moved with unnatural speed, that it could mimic voices to lure people away from safety. But the most terrifying part wasn't any of that. The most terrifying part was the hunger that never stopped growing. A Wendigo could devour an entire person and still be starving. It could eat until nothing was left and still need more. The hunger became the only thing that mattered, the only thing that existed. But here's the thing, the Wendigo wasn't really about cannibalism, at least not entirely. It was about selfishness. It was about putting your own survival above the community, about taking more than your share, about being willing to consume others to sustain yourself. In cultures where survival depended on cooperation, where sharing resources meant everyone had a chance and hoarding them meant someone would die, the Wendigo represented the ultimate betrayal. It was the embodiment of individualism taken to its most extreme conclusion, the idea that one person's life could be worth more than everyone else's combined. The stories served a purpose. They taught children why sharing mattered. They reminded adults that there were lines you didn't cross, no matter how desperate you became. They created a framework for understanding what happened when someone violated those principles, a way to talk about the unthinkable without having to describe it in plain terms. Because sometimes you can't just say, "Don't eat people." Sometimes you need to say, if you eat people, you become a monster that can never be satisfied, that will destroy everything around it, that will lose its humanity forever. The Wendigo doesn't punish hunger. It rewards it. It takes that first terrible moment of survival and turns it into a curse, a transformation that strips away everything that makes us human and leaves only the basest instinct to consume. And once that process starts, there's no going back. You don't recover from being a Wendigo. You don't find redemption. You just keep eating until someone stops you. That's the legend. That's what it meant before it became a pop culture icon. It was a mirror held up to the worst possibilities of human nature, a reminder that we're always just a few bad decisions away from becoming something unrecognizable. And in the long, dark winters of the northern forests, where hunger was a constant companion and survival was never guaranteed, that reminder wasn't abstract. It was real. It was necessary. It was terrifying. Let me tell you about a winter that nobody talks about anymore, a winter that happened in a small settlement somewhere in the Northern Territories around 1847. I'm not going to tell you exactly where because the place doesn't exist on maps anymore, and the people who lived through it made sure their names weren't recorded. But the story survived, passed down in whispers and fragments, the kind of story that people only tell when they're sure no one else is listening. There were maybe 30 people in this settlement, give or take. Families mostly, a few single men, all of them trying to make a life in a place that didn't want them there. They'd built cabins, cleared some land, started hunting and trapping. It was hard, brutal work, but they were managing. Until that winter. It started like any other winter. Snow came early, temperatures dropped, people settled in to wait it out. They had supplies. Not as much as they'd hoped, but enough. Or so they thought. But this winter was different. The snow kept falling and falling, drifts piling up higher than the cabin roofs, winds howling so loud you couldn't hear yourself think. The animals disappeared. Traplines came up empty. Hunting parties went out and came back with nothing. Days turned into weeks, weeks turned into months, and the food started running out. People made do. They rationed. They stretched meals as far as they could. They boiled bones for broth, scraped the insides of barrels, ate things they wouldn't have considered food under normal circumstances. But it wasn't enough. It was never going to be enough. Then one of the men disappeared. His name was Thomas, and he'd gone out to check the traplines one morning and never came back. They searched for him, or at least they said they did, but the snow was too deep and the cold too bitter and eventually they gave up. They told themselves he'd gotten lost, frozen to death, that there was nothing they could have done. They held a brief service and tried not to think about it. 2 weeks later, another man disappeared. Then a woman. Then a child. Always the same story, went out for something, didn't come back, searches turned up nothing. The settlement started to shrink, but the strange thing was how little people seemed to care. Oh, they said the right things. They expressed concern, they organized searches, they mourned. But there was something hollow about it, something performative. Like they were going through the motions because that's what you're supposed to do, not because they actually felt anything. And then the food situation started improving. Not dramatically, but noticeably. People stopped looking quite so gaunt. The rations got a little bigger. There was meat again, though nobody seemed entirely sure where it was coming from. When you asked, you got vague answers. Someone said they'd gotten lucky hunting. Someone else said they'd found old stores they'd forgotten about. The explanations didn't quite add up, but nobody pushed too hard. Because when you're starving, when your children are crying from hunger and your body is eating itself to stay alive, you don't ask too many questions about unexpected good fortune. There were signs, if you knew what to look for. Strange smells coming from certain cabins, the kind of smell that doesn't quite match anything you've encountered before. Smoke rising from chimneys at odd hours. People avoiding eye contact, conversations cutting off when you walked into a room. And the meat itself, when you got close enough to really look at it, didn't seem quite right. The texture was off. The color was strange. It tasted like food, like sustenance, like survival, but there was something about it that made your stomach turn even as you swallowed it down. One man, I'll call him Jacob though that wasn't his real name, started keeping a journal. He didn't write in it every day because paper was precious and there were more important things to worry about than documenting your thoughts. But every few days, he'd scratch out a few lines, usually late at night when everyone else was asleep. His entries got shorter and more cryptic as the winter went on, but the ones that survived tell a story. December, food running low. Worried about Mary and the children. Trying to stay hopeful. January, Thomas gone. Don't understand what happened. Too cold to search properly. February, ate meat today. Don't know where it came from. Tasted good. Felt wrong. March, can't stop thinking about the taste. Feel guilty but also relieved. What does that make me? April, saw something in John's cabin. Don't want to write what I think I saw. Can't unsee it. May, the winter is ending but I don't think we're the same people who started it. What Jacob saw in John's cabin, he never wrote down explicitly. But from the way his entries changed after that, from the way he started talking about guilt and complicity and the weight of knowing things you wish you didn't know, it's not hard to guess. He'd seen evidence. Maybe bones that were too familiar. Maybe tools being used for purposes they weren't meant for. Maybe just John's face, and whatever expression was on it, and the understanding that passed between them in that moment. The thing is, Jacob didn't tell anyone. He didn't raise an alarm. He didn't confront John. He went back to his own cabin, ate his own rations, and tried to pretend he hadn't seen anything. Because what was the alternative? Accuse John of something unspeakable and tear apart what was left of the community? Risk retaliation? Risk being cast out into the snow to die? Or worse, risk discovering that everyone already knew, that this was an open secret nobody wanted to acknowledge because acknowledging it would mean admitting what they'd all become? When food tastes better than guilt, something is wrong. That's not in Jacob's journal, but it might as well be. It's the unwritten truth hanging over every entry, every decision, every moment of that endless winter. Because the people in that settlement weren't monsters, at least not at first. They were just people trying to survive. And somewhere along the way, without even realizing it, they'd crossed a line. They'd made compromises. They'd looked the other way. They'd chosen hunger over humanity, over morality, over everything they'd been raised to believe was important. The winter ended eventually. The snow melted. Spring came. The survivors didn't talk about what had happened. They scattered, moved to different places, took their secrets with them. Jacob's journal was found decades later in the ruins of a collapsed cabin, water-damaged and barely legible, by someone who didn't understand the significance of what they were reading. Most of it has been lost to time. But enough survived to piece together the outline of the story, to understand what happened during that winter when nobody died officially, but the population of the settlement dropped by nearly half. There was no official investigation. No records were kept. The settlement itself faded from memory, just another failed attempt at taming the wilderness. But the people who lived through it carried the weight of it for the rest of their lives. Some of them confessed on their deathbeds. Others took it to their graves. A few passed the story down to their children, in whispers, as a warning about what happens when civilization breaks down and people are forced to make impossible choices. This is the part of the Wendigo legend that doesn't get told very often. Not the supernatural monster, not the glowing eyes in the darkness, but the real horror underneath. The horror of ordinary people becoming something they never thought they could be, of communities turning on themselves, of hunger proving stronger than every moral principle they'd ever held. The horror of knowing what you did, of living with it, of never being able to go back to who you were before. Here's what nobody tells you about becoming a monster: it doesn't happen all at once. There's no dramatic moment, no sudden change where you look in the mirror and see something different staring back. It happens so gradually, so incrementally, that you don't even notice until it's too late. And by then, you're not sure you want to go back. Let's stay with Jacob for a moment, because his story is everyone's story in that settlement. He was a good man by all accounts. Religious, hardworking, devoted to his family. The kind of person who'd give you the shirt off his back if you needed it, who believed in community and cooperation and doing the right thing even when it was hard. That was who he was before the winter. But that's not who he was after. The change started small. He stopped sleeping well. That makes sense, right? When you're hungry and cold and worried about survival, insomnia is natural. But this was different. He'd lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing with thoughts he couldn't control. Calculations. How many days of food did they have left? How long could a person survive without eating? What were the absolute limits of human endurance? And then, darker thoughts. Thoughts he tried to push away but that kept creeping back in. About who in the settlement was most essential. Who could be spared? What lines existed between people and resources? He became paranoid, though he wouldn't have used that word. Watchful. Careful. He noticed things he'd never paid attention to before, like how much food other families had, how they stored it, when they ate, who was gaining weight and who was losing it. He started seeing threats everywhere, started believing that everyone was looking out for themselves and he needed to do the same or his family would suffer. Trust, which had been the foundation of the community, eroded. Not just for him but for everyone. You could see it in the way people interacted, the way conversations became guarded, the way no one wanted to turn their backs anymore. Then came the intrusive thoughts. Not the kind you can dismiss as imagination, but the kind that feel like they're coming from somewhere outside yourself, like they're being whispered by something else. What would it take? How would you do it? Would anyone notice? These weren't hypotheticals. They were active planning, his brain working through scenarios without his permission, running simulations of the unspeakable and finding solutions. And the worst part, the part that terrified him more than anything, was how reasonable it all seemed. How logical. How justified. Because here's the thing about extreme situations, they recalibrate your sense of morality. What would be unthinkable under normal circumstances starts to seem like a viable option when the alternative is watching your children starve to death. Your brain does this amazing thing where it creates justifications, builds frameworks of reasoning that make the unacceptable acceptable. It tells you that you're not doing something evil, you're doing something necessary. That you're not a monster, you're a survivor. That anyone in your position would make the same choice. The first time Jacob ate the meat, he knew. Maybe not consciously, maybe not in a way he could articulate, but some part of him understood what he was putting in his mouth. And he ate it anyway. Because his stomach was cramping with hunger. Because his daughter had fainted that morning from malnutrition. Because he was so tired of being cold and scared and desperate. And you know what? It helped. It gave him strength. It quieted the gnawing emptiness that had been consuming him from the inside. It made him feel human again, even as it was stripping away his humanity. That's the paradox at the heart of the Wendigo legend. The thing that sustains you is the thing that destroys you. The act that keeps you alive is the act that kills who you are. And once you cross that threshold, once you break that ultimate taboo, something in you changes permanently. You can't unknow what you've done. You can't unfeel the relief you felt when the hunger stopped. You can't pretend you're still the person you were before. Jacob started eating more. Not because he needed to, but because he wanted to. The taste became familiar, then preferable. His body, which had been on the verge of shutting down, came roaring back to life. He had energy again. Strength. Warmth. But along with the physical vitality came something else, something harder to define. A coldness in his emotional responses. A distance from his own actions. A sense that he was watching himself from outside, seeing this person who looked like him make decisions that the old Jacob would have found incomprehensible. The scariest thing wasn't what he ate. It was how reasonable it felt. How quickly he adapted. How little he struggled with the decision after the first time. Because that's what the Wendigo really represents, not a monster that attacks you, but a transformation that happens within you. It's the moment when your survival instinct overrides everything else, when you shed the layers of civilization and morality and social conditioning that make you human and reveal what's underneath. And what's underneath isn't pretty. It's hungry. It's ruthless. It's willing to do anything. Other people in the settlement went through the same process. Some faster, some slower, but all of them moving in the same direction. The community that had started the winter as a group of families trying to help each other ended it as a collection of individuals trying to survive by any means necessary. They stopped talking about the disappearances. They stopped asking questions. They developed an unspoken agreement to not look too closely at what was happening, because looking closely would mean acknowledging it, and acknowledging it would mean making a choice between speaking up and becoming complicit. Most of them chose complicity. Not because they were evil, but because they were human. Because humans are incredibly good at rationalization, at finding ways to live with things they know are wrong. We tell ourselves stories. We create narratives where we're still the heroes, where our actions are justified, where we had no choice. And in that settlement, during that winter, everyone told themselves the same story: we're doing what we have to do to survive. This isn't who we are. This is just what the situation demands. When it's over, we'll go back to normal. But they didn't go back to normal. You can't go back from something like that. The people who walked out of that settlement in the spring were fundamentally different from the people who'd entered it in the fall. They'd learned things about themselves they could never unlearn. They'd discovered capabilities they'd never known they had. They'd felt hungers they'd never imagined. And they'd satisfied those hungers in ways that changed them forever. This is what the Wendigo legend is really about. Not the monster in the woods, but the monster you become. The transformation that happens when hunger meets opportunity, when desperation meets weakness, when the line between acceptable and unacceptable blurs until you can't see it anymore. It's about the moment when you realize that being a good person is easy when you're comfortable, but when comfort disappears, when survival becomes uncertain, when hunger becomes the only thing you can think about, goodness becomes a luxury most people can't afford. So here's where I break the story wide open. Here's where I tell you the truth that makes all of this even more disturbing than you probably thought it was. There was no Wendigo in the woods. Let that sink in for a second. No glowing eyes watching from the trees. No supernatural creature stalking the settlement. No curse or spirit or ancient evil. Just people. Just human beings making human choices under inhuman circumstances. The Wendigo was sitting at the table. Every meal that got served. Every ration that got distributed. Every time someone said they'd been lucky hunting. The Wendigo was there, wearing a familiar face, speaking in a familiar voice, acting like everything was normal. Because that's the real horror of the legend. It's not about monsters invading from outside. It's about the monsters we become when we think no one's watching, when we think we can get away with it, when we convince ourselves that survival justifies anything. The settlers in that community didn't get attacked by a Wendigo. They became it. Collectively, gradually, one choice at a time. They transformed from a group of people who cared about each other into a group of people who cared only about not starving. And that transformation didn't require magic or curses. It just required hunger and isolation and time. Think about what that means. Think about how the Wendigo legend functions as a cultural memory, a way of passing down the knowledge of what happened in winters like that one without having to spell it out explicitly. Because you can't just tell people, our ancestors ate each other to survive. That's too direct, too horrifying, too impossible to integrate into your understanding of who you are and where you come from. But you can tell them, our ancestors warned us about the Wendigo, a creature that represents the dangers of selfishness and greed. You can wrap the truth in mythology and make it digestible. The people who created the Wendigo legend knew exactly what they were doing. They were creating a framework for talking about the worst aspects of human nature without having to confront them directly. They were building a cultural immune system, a way of identifying and rejecting behaviors that threatened the community. They were saying, this is what happens when you put yourself above others. This is what happens when you consume without restraint. This is what happens when hunger becomes your only principle. And the genius of it, the absolute brilliance of it, is that by making the Wendigo a supernatural creature, they made it something that could be fought, could be resisted, could be prevented. Because if the Wendigo is just an evil spirit that possesses people, then you can protect yourself with rituals and rules and communal vigilance. But if the Wendigo is just human nature revealed, if it's the thing that lives inside all of us waiting for the right circumstances to emerge, then there's no real protection. Then we're all potential Wendigos, all one bad winter away from becoming the thing we fear. That's what keeps me up at night. Not the stories about creatures in the woods, but the realization of what those stories represent. The knowledge that every single person in that settlement probably started the winter thinking they were good people, moral people, people who would never do something like that. And every single person was wrong. Because morality isn't a fixed trait. It's a practice, a constant negotiation between what we want and what we believe is right. And when circumstances change dramatically enough, when the stakes get high enough, that negotiation breaks down. The want wins. The hunger wins. Jacob's journal has one more entry, written years after that winter, found tucked into a Bible he kept until his death. It says, "I am haunted not by what I did, but by how easy it was to do it. How quickly I adapted. How little I fought against it. I look at people now and wonder what they would do in the same situation. I wonder if everyone is like me, just waiting for the right circumstances to reveal themselves. I wonder if there's any real difference between the person who commits an atrocity and the person who hasn't been given the opportunity yet." That's the revelation. That's what the Wendigo story has been trying to tell us all along. The monster isn't something separate from us. It's not an external threat we can fight and defeat. It's us. It's what we're capable of when we're pushed far enough, when we're hungry enough, when we're desperate enough. And the most terrifying part is that we won't see it happening. We'll rationalize. We'll justify. We'll tell ourselves we had no choice, that anyone would do the same, that survival is the highest moral principle. But survival at what cost? That's the question the Wendigo poses. If you have to destroy your humanity to stay alive, have you really survived? If you become something unrecognizable in the process of not dying, what exactly have you preserved? These aren't academic questions. They're practical ones, ones that people throughout history have had to answer in real time, in situations where there was no good option, only degrees of terrible. The Wendigo legend survives because it's true. Not literally true, not in the sense of being an accurate description of a creature that exists in the physical world. But true in the sense that it captures something essential about human nature, something we need to be reminded of constantly because forgetting it is dangerous. It tells us that we're capable of more than we think, both good and bad. It tells us that circumstances matter, that context shapes behavior in ways we don't like to admit. It tells us that the monsters aren't out there in the darkness. They're in here, in us, waiting. Now let's talk about why this matters today, because I can already hear some of you thinking, okay, but I'm never going to be trapped in a cabin starving during a brutal winter, so this doesn't really apply to me. And you're right. You probably won't. But the Wendigo doesn't need a cabin anymore. It doesn't need winter. It doesn't need physical starvation. Because hunger takes many forms, and the transformation it causes isn't limited to desperate survival situations. Let's talk about the hunger for power. Not the kind of power that comes from positions of authority, although that's part of it, but the deeper hunger to have control over your circumstances, to feel like you matter, to be able to shape the world according to your will. That's a universal human desire, and there's nothing wrong with it in moderation. But like all hungers, it grows when you feed it. You get a taste of power and you want more. You achieve one level of influence and immediately start thinking about the next. The more you have, the more you need, and before long you're making decisions you never thought you'd make, compromising principles you thought were absolute, justifying actions you once would have condemned, all in service of acquiring and maintaining power. Or think about the hunger for status. We live in a world obsessed with hierarchies, with ranking people, with determining who's more successful or more accomplished or more worthy of attention and respect. Social media has turned this into a competitive sport where everyone can see everyone else's score. You check your phone and see that someone has more followers than you, more likes, more engagement, and something in your brain shifts. You start performing. You start curating your life not based on what's authentic or meaningful, but on what will generate the most positive response. You become obsessed with metrics, with numbers, with external validation. And the more you get, the more you need. 100 likes isn't enough anymore. 1,000 isn't enough. Nothing is ever enough because the hunger keeps growing. The hunger for consumption is even more obvious. We've built an entire civilization around the idea that buying things will make us happy, that accumulating possessions equals success, that you can fill the emptiness inside you with products and experiences and stuff. Entire industries exist solely to manufacture desire, to convince you that you need things you never knew existed, to make you feel inadequate unless you're constantly consuming. And it works. We consume at levels that would have been unimaginable to our grandparents, and we're less satisfied than ever. Because consumption is a hunger that feeds itself. The more you have, the more you want. The temporary satisfaction of acquiring something new fades almost immediately, replaced by the need to acquire the next thing. Even emotional hunger, the need to be loved, to be validated, to be seen and understood and valued. That's not a bad need. That's a fundamental human need. But it can become Wendigo hunger when it becomes insatiable, when no amount of love or attention or affirmation is ever enough, when you start consuming other people emotionally, taking and never giving back, leaving a trail of exhausted relationships in your wake because you've turned into a black hole that nothing can fill. The mechanism is the same as the original Wendigo legend. Start with a legitimate need or desire. Add circumstances that amplify it, whether that's social pressure or economic systems or psychological vulnerability. Remove or erode the normal limits that would constrain that hunger, the community standards or moral frameworks or practical considerations that would say, this is enough, you can stop now. And then watch what happens. Watch how quickly the hunger grows. Watch how the person who started with a reasonable want transforms into someone willing to do unreasonable things to satisfy it. Watch how justifications pile up, how rationalization becomes a reflex, how the gap between who they think they are and who they're actually becoming widens until it's a chasm. The Wendigo doesn't need forests anymore. It thrives in cities, in corporations, in political systems, in online communities. Anywhere there are people with hungers and systems that amplify those hungers instead of moderating them, the Wendigo is at work. It's not supernatural. It's not mysterious. It's just the same dynamic playing out in different contexts, the same transformation from human to something that looks human but isn't, the same process of hunger overriding everything else. And here's the really disturbing part, we celebrate it. We've rebranded Wendigo behavior as ambition, as drive, as the hunger for success. We tell people to never be satisfied, to always want more, to hustle and grind and consume without limit. We've turned the thing that indigenous peoples warned against, the thing they built entire mythologies to help people resist, into a virtue. We've made monsters and called them role models. Look at the way we talk about successful people. They're hungry for success. They have an insatiable drive. They consume markets. They're willing to do whatever it takes. These are Wendigo qualities. These are the same traits that defined the people in that settlement who decided that survival justified anything. But we've dressed them up in business casual and given them TED Talks. And the worst part is that it works, at least superficially. The people who embody these qualities often do achieve external success. They accumulate wealth, status, power. They get what they're hungry for, or at least the appearance of it. But at what cost? Look closer and you'll often find people who are deeply unsatisfied, who can never rest, who've sacrificed relationships and health and peace of mind in pursuit of more. You'll find people who've become so identified with their hunger that they don't know who they are without it. You'll find people who've transformed into something they didn't mean to become, who are trapped by their own success in ways they don't know how to escape. This is why the Wendigo legend matters. Not as a historical curiosity or a piece of folklore we can appreciate from a distance, but as a living warning about patterns that are still active, still dangerous, still transforming people every day. It's a diagnostic tool, a way of recognizing when legitimate needs have mutated into destructive hungers, when we've crossed the line from healthy ambition to Wendigo consumption. The question isn't whether you'll ever face physical starvation. The question is whether you can recognize the other forms of hunger before they transform you. Can you tell when your desire for success has become an addiction? Can you notice when your need for validation has turned into something that consumes you and everyone around you? Can you identify the moment when what started as a reasonable goal became an insatiable hunger that justifies increasingly questionable behavior? Because that's where the Wendigo lives now. Not in the woods, but in the gap between who we want to be and what our hungers make us become. It's in every moment we choose short-term satisfaction over long-term values. It's in every compromise we make with ourselves, every time we say, just this once, or, it's not that bad, or, everyone does it. It's in the accumulation of small decisions that slowly reshape us until we look in the mirror one day and don't quite recognize what's looking back. The modern Wendigo doesn't announce itself. It doesn't transform you with a curse or a bite. It just encourages you to feed your hungers, to never be satisfied, to always want more. And it promises that satisfaction is just around the corner, that the next achievement or acquisition or validation will be the one that finally fills the emptiness. But it's lying. It's always lying. Because that's what Wendigo hunger does. It grows. It's never satisfied. It consumes everything and demands more. So let's come back to where we started. The Wendigo wasn't born screaming in the woods. It was born starving. But now we understand what that means. It means the Wendigo is born every time hunger becomes more important than humanity. Every time someone decides that their needs justify consuming others. Every time the want for more overrides the recognition that enough is enough. The original Algonquin peoples who created this legend understood something profound about human nature, something we're still struggling to fully grasp. They understood that the greatest danger doesn't come from external threats. It comes from internal transformations. They understood that civilization is thin, that the rules and norms and moral frameworks that make society function are fragile constructions that can collapse under pressure. They understood that everyone is capable of becoming something they'd be horrified by, given the right circumstances and enough hunger. That's not pessimism. That's realism. And ironically, accepting that reality is the first step toward preventing it. Because when you acknowledge that you're capable of transformation, when you recognize the signs of Wendigo hunger in yourself, you can resist it. You can make different choices. You can reinforce the frameworks that keep hunger in its proper place instead of letting it consume everything. The people in that settlement in 1847 didn't think of themselves as bad people. They didn't wake up one morning and decide to become monsters. They were just trying to survive an impossible situation. But somewhere along the way, in the accumulation of small compromises and rationalizations and choices made under extreme stress, they crossed a line. And once they crossed it, they couldn't uncross it. They had to live with what they'd done, carry that weight for the rest of their lives, pass down the trauma and guilt and knowledge to their descendants. We have the advantage they didn't have. We're not facing literal starvation in an isolated cabin. We have perspective. We have choice. We can look at our hungers and decide which ones to feed and which ones to starve. We can recognize when we're moving in a Wendigo direction and course correct before the transformation is complete. We can build communities and systems that moderate hunger instead of amplifying it, that remind us of our shared humanity instead of encouraging us to consume each other. But that requires vigilance. It requires honesty about what we're capable of. It requires accepting that the monster isn't something separate from us, something we can point to and say, that's evil and I'm not. The monster is potential. It exists in everyone, dormant, waiting for hunger and circumstance to activate it. And the only real defense is constant awareness, constant choice, constant reinforcement of the values and connections that make us human. Jacob's final journal entry, the one hidden in his Bible, ended with a question. He asked, "What's the difference between someone who commits an atrocity and someone who hasn't been given the opportunity yet?" I think the answer is this: the difference is in what you do when the opportunity arises. The difference is in whether you recognize the hunger for what it is and choose to resist it, or whether you give in and tell yourself you had no choice. Because you always have a choice. Maybe not a good choice, maybe not a choice that doesn't cost you something, but a choice nonetheless. The people in that settlement had choices. Hard choices, impossible choices, choices that would haunt them either way. But they made them. And the choices they made defined who they became. If hunger teaches anything, it's how thin civilization really is. How quickly the structures that make us civil can break down. How easily we can rationalize the unthinkable. How little separates the person who helps their neighbor from the person who consumes them. It's not a comfortable lesson. It's not a reassuring one. But it's a necessary one. Because understanding the Wendigo means understanding ourselves. Understanding that we're not fixed beings, but works in progress, constantly shaped by circumstances and choices. Understanding that morality is a practice, not a trait, something we have to actively maintain rather than something we passively possess. Understanding that the hungers we feed grow, and the hungers we starve diminish, and we get to choose which is which every single day. The Wendigo was never the monster. Hunger was. But hunger itself isn't evil. Hunger is natural. Hunger is necessary. Hunger is what drives us to survive, to strive, to achieve. The danger comes when hunger becomes the only thing that matters, when it overrides every other consideration, when we feed it without restraint until it transforms us into something we never meant to become. So pay attention to your hungers. Notice when they're growing. Ask yourself what you're feeding them and why. Question the justifications you give yourself for behaviors you wouldn't have accepted in the past. Recognize when you're starting to rationalize away your principles in service of satisfaction. And when you catch yourself moving in that direction, make a different choice. Not because it's easy, but because it's the only way to stay human. The settlers who survived that winter carried their secret for the rest of their lives. They tried to bury it, forget it, pretend it never happened. But it shaped everything they did afterward. Some of them became more generous, as if trying to atone for what they'd done. Others became more isolated, unable to trust themselves or anyone else. A few confessed, seeking absolution they never quite found. All of them were changed, marked by the knowledge of what they were capable of. We don't have to carry that same burden. We have the gift of their story, the warning encoded in the Wendigo legend, the knowledge passed down through generations about what happens when hunger wins. We can learn from their mistakes without having to make them ourselves. We can recognize the patterns, resist the transformation, choose differently. But only if we acknowledge the truth. Only if we accept that the Wendigo isn't a monster in the woods or a supernatural curse or something that only affected people in the past. It's a pattern, a process, a potential that exists in all of us. It's what we become when we let hunger override humanity, when we prioritize consumption over connection, when we tell ourselves that our needs are more important than our principles. The Wendigo is still here. It never left. It just changed form. It adapted to modern circumstances the same way it adapted to every other era and context where humans faced hunger and chose to feed it without restraint. It's in our offices and our homes and our phones and our hearts, whispering that we deserve more, that we need more, that we should take more, that satisfaction is just one more bite away. And the only thing that can stop it is us. Our choices. Our recognition of what's happening. Our willingness to say, no, this is enough. I don't need to consume any more. I can live with what I have. I can be satisfied with who I am. I can resist this hunger. That's the real ending to the Wendigo story. Not a creature defeated or a curse broken, but a choice made. Every day, every moment, a choice between feeding the hunger and feeding our humanity. Between becoming more of what we want to be and becoming something we'll spend the rest of our lives regretting. Monsters aren't born. They're made. And they're made through the accumulation of small choices, moment by moment, hunger by hunger, until the transformation is complete. The Wendigo legend exists to remind us of that truth, to keep us vigilant, to help us recognize the warning signs before it's too late. So the next time you feel that insatiable hunger, that need for more that nothing seems to satisfy, that willingness to compromise your values for the sake of getting what you want, remember the Wendigo. Remember what it represents. Remember that it's not a monster out there, but a transformation in here. And remember that you have the power to resist it, to choose differently, to stay human even when hunger is screaming at you to become something else. Because in the end, that's what separates us from monsters. Not that we don't feel hunger. Not that we're never tempted. Not that we're somehow above the same drives and desires that shaped people in that settlement all those years ago. What separates us is the choice we make when faced with that hunger. Whether we feed it without restraint or whether we recognize it for what it is and choose to be something better. The Wendigo was never the monster. Hunger was. And hunger is still here, still growing, still transforming people every day. The only question is whether you'll recognize it in time to resist it. Whether you'll make the hard choice to stay human when everything in you is screaming to consume. Whether you'll be the person who breaks the pattern or the person who continues it. That choice is yours. It always has been. And it always will be. The Wendigo wasn't born screaming in the woods. It was born starving. And it's waiting to see what you'll do with your hunger.